I thought I knew everything about my family's boring history until my DNA test revealed that my sweet great-grandmother, who baked cookies and knitted sweaters, was actually a World War II spy who had been living under a completely false identity for over 60 years. My name is Alex. I'm 28 years old, and I've always been the family historian. You know that person in every family who gets obsessed with genealogy and asks way too many questions at family reunions? That was me. I had binders full of old photographs, family trees sketched on napkins, and a burning curiosity about where we came from. Growing up, my great-grandmother, Alina, was the heart of our family. She lived with us from the time I was 5 until she passed away when I was 16. And honestly, she was more like a second mother to me than a great-grandmother. Every morning, I'd wake up to the smell of her homemade bread and the sound of her humming old songs in what she claimed was broken English mixed with her native Polish. Alina had this incredible way of making everyone feel special. She'd sit with me for hours, teaching me to knit these impossibly complicated patterns, while telling me stories about the old country. Her hands were always busy knitting, cooking, mending clothes, but her eyes would get this faraway look when she talked about Poland. She'd describe fields of sunflowers, little villages with cobblestone streets, and a family she'd lost during the war. According to family lore, Alina had fled Poland in 1947 with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small suitcase. She met my great-grandfather Robert at a church social in Chicago just 6 months after arriving in America. It was supposedly love at first sight. This beautiful, mysterious European woman who spoke broken English, and this kind-hearted mechanic who fell head over heels for her accent and her incredible cooking. They married within a year, and Alina completely embraced American life. She learned English with remarkable speed, became a citizen as soon as she could, and threw herself into being the perfect American housewife. She joined the Church Ladies Auxiliary, hosted bridge games, and made the most incredible pierogi for every church potluck. Everyone in our small Michigan town knew Alina as the sweet Polish immigrant who'd made good in America. But there were always these little things that didn't quite add up, you know? Like how she never wanted anyone to take her picture, even at family events. She'd literally hide behind people or suddenly find urgent business in the kitchen whenever cameras came out. And her stories about Poland were always vague, beautiful, and poetic, but lacking in specific details about actual places or people. My mom used to joke that Alina was probably hiding a secret fortune somewhere because, despite living through the Depression and never working outside the home, she always seemed to have money when the family needed it. Not a lot, but enough. When my grandfather needed surgery in the 1960s, Alina somehow produced enough cash to cover the hospital bills. When my dad wanted to go to college but couldn't afford it, Alina quietly paid his tuition. The most puzzling thing was her language skills. She claimed to speak only Polish and English, but I caught her responding perfectly to our Spanish-speaking neighbors more than once. And there was this one time when I was about 12, watching a French movie with subtitles while she knitted nearby. She started commenting on the plot before the subtitles appeared, then caught herself and pretended she'd been guessing. Lena also had this uncanny ability to read people. She could spot a liar from across the room and had opinions about everyone's character that were usually spottin'. My mom always said Alina had old-world intuition, but it was more than that. She studied people with an intensity that seemed almost professional. When Alina passed away at 91, we found her small collection of personal belongings tucked away in an old shoebox. There were a few photographs of people we didn't recognize, some jewelry that looked expensive, and a small leather journal filled with what appeared to be coded messages, or maybe just really bad handwriting in multiple languages. My family dismissed it all as the sentimental keepsakes of an old woman, but I couldn't let it go. The photographs showed Alina looking glamorous and sophisticated in ways that didn't match the humble housewife we knew. In one picture, she was wearing an elegant evening gown and jewelry that definitely didn't come from Sears catalog. In another, she was standing next to a man in what looked like a military uniform, but not an American one. For years after Alina's death, I kept digging into our family history, but I kept hitting dead ends. Immigration records were sparse, and the few documents I could find seemed to contradict each other. Alina's maiden name appeared differently on various forms. Her birth year fluctuated by several years. And the Polish town she claimed to be from either didn't exist or had no records of anyone matching her description. By the time I turned 25, I'd exhausted every traditional genealogy resource I could think of. That est when my cousin mentioned she'd done one of those DNA tests and found some surprising connections to relatives she'd never heard of. She suggested I try it, thinking it might help fill in some of the gaps in Elena's mysterious background. I'll be honest, I was skeptical about DNA testing. It seemed too easy, too modern for the kind of old-world mysteries I was trying to solve. But I was running out of options, and the scientist in me was curious about what my genetic makeup might reveal about our family's true origins. I figured at worst, I'd get confirmation of our Polish heritage and maybe connect with some distant cousins still living in Europe. At best, I might finally get some concrete answers about Elena's past, and why so much of her story never quite added up. I had no idea I was about to uncover a family secret that would rewrite everything I thought I knew about the sweet, simple woman who had raised me and changed my understanding of what it means to reinvent yourself in America. The first red flag came when I got my initial DNA results back, and they were nothing like what I expected. Instead of the straightforward Polish heritage Elena had always claimed, my genetic breakdown looked like a United Nations meeting. I had significant percentages of German, Czech, Russian, and yes, some Polish, but also traces of French, Hungarian, and even a small percentage of Scandinavian DNA that nobody could explain. I stared at those results for hours, trying to make sense of it all. Elena had been so specific about being from a small Polish village, about her family's generations-old traditions, about the pierogi recipe that had been passed down from her grandmother. But my DNA was telling a completely different story, one of someone whose family had clearly moved around a lot, possibly across multiple countries and borders. The cousin matches were even more confusing. I expected to connect with relatives from Poland, maybe some distant cousins still living in the villages Elena had described. Instead, I was getting matches with people from Germany, the Czech Republic, and Austria, with names that didn't sound remotely familiar. Most strange of all, many of these genetic relatives had family trees that included people with the same last names as Elena, but in completely different countries and time periods. I started reaching out to some of these DNA matches, and that's when things got really weird. One woman, Maria, who showed up as a potential third cousin, was from Germany and had been researching her family tree for decades. When I told her about Elena's stories of fleeing Poland in 1947, she got very quiet and then asked me to send her Elena's photograph. 3 days later, Maria called me, and I could hear the excitement and confusion in her voice. She told me that Elena looked remarkably similar to a woman in her family photographs from the 1940s. But this woman wasn't Polish at all. She was German, and according to Maria's research, she had disappeared during the chaos at the end of World War II. But here's where it got really unsettling. Maria's research suggested that this woman, who might have been Elena, hadn't just disappeared. She had been involved in some kind of intelligence work during the war. Maria was cautious about sharing details, but she mentioned resistance networks, coded messages, and people who had to completely change their identities to survive. I started having these late-night conversations with Maria, comparing family stories and photographs. The more we talked, the more convinced we both became that Elena and Maria's missing relative were the same person. But if that was true, then everything Elena had told us about her background was a carefully constructed lie. The implications started hitting me in waves. If Elena wasn't who she claimed to be, then what had she been involved in during the war? Why had she needed to create a completely false identity? And why had she maintained that lie for over 60 years, even with her own family? I began looking at Elena's behavior through this new lens, and suddenly all those little inconsistencies I'd noticed over the years started making sense in a very unsettling way. Her reluctance to be photographed wasn't shyness. It was the caution of someone who could risk being recognized. Her mysterious ability to produce money when needed was unfamily savings. It might have been payments or support from some kind of network. Most disturbing of all, her uncanny ability to read people and her knowledge of multiple languages weren't just natural gifts. They sounded like the skills of someone who had been trained in intelligence work. Someone whose survival had depended on being able to assess threats and blend into different environments. Started researching World War II espionage networks, resistance movements, and what happened to intelligence operatives after the war ended. What I found made my stomach turn. There were documented cases of people who had worked for various intelligence services during the war, and then had to completely disappear and reinvent themselves. When the political landscape changed, some had been double agents. Others had worked for the wrong side and needed new identities to escape prosecution. Still others had simply known too much and needed to vanish for their own protection. The common thread was that these people often fled to America, created entirely new backgrounds for themselves, and lived the rest of their lives maintaining elaborate lies about their past. The more I researched, the more I realized that Alina's story, the sweet Polish immigrant narrative, was textbook perfect for someone who needed to blend in and disappear. A war refugee with a tragic past that explained why she had no family connections, no documentation, and no one who could contradict her story. I started questioning everything. Had Alina actually loved my great-grandfather, or had he been a convenient cover story? Had her devotion to our family been genuine, or were we just part of her carefully maintained disguise? The woman I'd thought I knew, the grandmother who had taught me to knit and filled my childhood with warmth and security, might have been a complete fabrication. But the worst part was the growing suspicion about what Alina might have done during the war. The research I was finding about wartime intelligence operatives wasn't pretty. These people had done things. Necessary things, maybe, but terrible things nonetheless. They had betrayed friends, stolen secrets, and sometimes killed people to protect their missions or their covers. I found myself lying awake at night, wondering if the hands that had braided my hair and bandaged my scraped knees had also pulled triggers or passed information that led to people as deaths. Sounds dramatic, but when you discover that everything you believed about someone's past was a lie, your imagination goes to some very dark places. The gentle, loving woman who had been the foundation of my childhood might have been one of the most dangerous people I'd ever known. Hiding in plain sight for decades, maintaining a perfect performance that had fooled everyone who loved her. I realized I couldn't keep this discovery to myself much longer. But I also wasn't sure I was ready for the answers I might find. After weeks of sleepless nights and obsessive research, I knew I had reached a breaking point. I couldn't continue living with these suspicions about Alina without getting concrete answers. But I also realized that my DNA results alone weren't going to solve this mystery. I needed more family members to test, more genetic connections to confirm or deny what I was starting to suspect. The problem was, I couldn't exactly approach my family with, "Hey, I think our beloved great-grandmother might have been a spy. Want to spit in a tube to help me prove it?" My parents had adored Elena, and my grandmother, Elena's daughter-in-law, still talked about her as if she'd been a saint. They remembered the woman who had helped raise their children, who had been there for every crisis, who had made their house feel like home. I decided to start small, convinced my mom to do a DNA test by telling her I was trying to connect with distant relatives in Poland, and that having more family members tested would help narrow down the search. She agreed readily enough, excited about the possibility of finding cousins in the old country and maybe planning a heritage trip together. While we waited for Mom's results, I continued corresponding with Maria in Germany. She had become just as invested in solving this mystery as I was, and she started sharing more detailed information about her missing relative. The woman's name had been Katarina Hoffmann, and according to Maria's family records, she had been involved with partisan activities during the war before disappearing in 1946. Maria sent me copies of documents she'd found in her grandfather's papers, letters, photographs, and what appeared to be coded messages. Looking at the handwriting in those letters and comparing it to the journal entries I'd found in Alina's belongings made my blood run cold. The writing styles were remarkably similar, especially in the way certain letters were formed and the distinctive way the writer crossed her TS and dotted her IS. But the most chilling discovery came when Maria shared a photograph of Katarina that her family had never seen before. She'd found it tucked inside an old book, and it showed a young woman who looked exactly like Alina, but wearing what appeared to be a German uniform and standing next to several men in military dress. On the back, someone had written KH Prague, 1944. I stared at that photograph for hours, comparing it to pictures of Alina from the 1950s. The facial structure was identical. It's down to a small scar above the left eyebrow that Alina had always claimed came from falling off her bicycle as a child in Poland. If this wasn't the same person, it was the most incredible coincidence I'd ever encountered. When Mom's DNA results came back, they confirmed my worst fears and answered some questions I'd been afraid to ask. Not only did she share significant DNA matches with Maria and other relatives from Germany, but her genetic profile showed a pattern that suggested Alina had indeed been born somewhere in Central Europe, possibly in the region that had changed hands multiple times during and after the war. But there was another revelation in Mom's results that I hadn't expected. She had several DNA matches with people whose family trees included names I recognized from my research into World War II intelligence networks. These were on random connections. They were patterns that suggested Alina had been part of a specific community or network of people who had all ended up in America around the same time period. I started reaching out to more of these genetic matches, being very careful about how I approached the subject. What I discovered was that several families in our extended DNA network had similar stories. Mysterious grandparents or great-grandparents who had arrived in America after the war with vague stories about their backgrounds and no verifiable documentation of their early lives. One match: a man named David, whose grandmother had claimed to be a refugee from Hungary, told me that his family had always suspected their grandmother was hiding something. Like Alina, she had been reluctant to be photographed, had unexpected language skills, and possessed an unusual ability to assess people's character and motivations. Another match, whose grandfather had supposedly fled Czechoslovakia, mentioned finding coded messages among his grandfather's belongings and discovering that the man had maintained correspondence with people all over the world using multiple names and addresses. The pattern was becoming undeniable. It seemed like Alina hadn't been operating alone. She had been part of a network of people who had all assumed new identities and scattered across America after the war. Whether they had been spies, resistance fighters, or something else entirely, they had clearly been coordinating their disappearances and maintaining some level of contact with each other. I realized that, to get the full truth, I needed to expand the DNA testing to include more family members and try to connect with more people from this apparent network. I also knew that I was probably going to have to confront my family with what I was discovering, even if it meant shattering their memories of Alina. But first, I decided to do one more DNA test, this time using a different company that specialized in genealogy research and had access to historical records that might not be available through traditional genealogy resources. I also upgraded to their premium service, which promised to connect genetic results with historical documents, immigration records, and military service files. I submitted my sample with a mixture of excitement and dread. Part of me hoped that this additional testing would prove that I'd been wrong all along, that there was some innocent explanation for all the inconsistencies and mysterious connections I'd been finding. But a larger part of me suspected that I was about to uncover truths about Alina that would change not just how I understood my family history, but how I understood the nature of identity, survival, and the secrets people carry with them. As I sealed the envelope with my DNA sample, I could unhelp but think about Alina and wonder what she would think about what I was doing. Would she be proud that her great-grandson had inherited her analytical mind and determination to uncover the truth? Or would she be terrified that decades of carefully maintained secrets were about to be exposed? I mailed the sample and settled in to wait for results that I suspected would finally reveal who Alina really was. The email notification arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was having coffee and trying to concentrate on work. I'd been checking my email obsessively for weeks, and when I saw the subject line, "Your advanced DNA results are ready," my hands actually started shaking. I closed my laptop, took a deep breath, and opened the email on my phone. The initial genetic breakdown was similar to what I'd seen before, but the premium service had provided something I had unexpected: connections to historical records and databases that were unavailable to the public. As I scrolled through the results, I found a section labeled Historical Document Matches that made my heart stop. There, in black and white, was a match between my DNA profile and records from the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the CIA. The match was connected to someone listed as Agent K. Hoffman, with a notation that this person had been involved in intelligence operations in occupied Europe. Between 1943 and 1946, I dropped my phone and had to pace around my apartment for 10 minutes before I could look at the screen again, and I finally picked it up. I saw that there were additional matches to records from British intelligence services and something called the Special Operations Executive, which I later learned was a British organization that conducted espionage and reconnaissance behind enemy lines during World War II, but the most shocking discovery was yet to come. The system had also matched my DNA to immigration records that showed someone named Elena Kowalski entering the United States in 1947, but with a notation that her documentation had been processed through a special program for displaced intelligence assets. In other words, Elena hadn't just been a war refugee. She had been a spy who was being relocated and given a new identity by American intelligence services. A detailed report provided information I never could have found through traditional genealogy research. It showed that Katerina Hoffman had been recruited by the British, so in 1942, and had operated throughout Central Europe, gathering intelligence on German troop movements and helping coordinate resistance activities. She had worked under multiple identities and had been considered one of their most effective operatives. But here's where the story got complicated. According to the records, in late 1945, there were concerns that Katerina's cover had been compromised and that she was being hunted by both German war criminals seeking revenge and Soviet forces who viewed her as a threat. The decision was made to extract her and several other operatives and relocate them to the United States under completely new identities. The documentation showed that Elena Kowalski had been created as a legend, spy terminology for a false identity, complete with fabricated background, forged documents, and a carefully constructed personal history. The Polish refugee story hadn't been Elena's real past. It had been a cover story designed by professional intelligence officers to explain why she had no verifiable history or family connections. As I read through page after page of these revelations, I felt like I was learning about a completely different person, the Elena I had known. The grandmother who made cookies and taught me to knit had actually been a trained killer who could speak at least 6 languages fluently and had spent years living behind enemy lines gathering secrets that had helped win the war. The records showed that she had been responsible for coordinating the activities of dozens of resistance fighters had helped plan sabotage operations that had disrupted German supply lines and had been directly involved in the extraction of Allied prisoners from occupied territories. In one documented mission, she had single-handedly eliminated 3 German officers who had discovered her network, saving the lives of 12 resistance fighters. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation was what had happened to many of her colleagues. The records showed that several other operatives who had worked with Elena during the war had been found dead under mysterious circumstances in the years following their relocation to America. There were suggestions that someone had been systematically tracking down and eliminating former intelligence operatives, possibly as part of a revenge operation by surviving Nazi officials. This explained so much about Elena's behavior that I had never understood. Her reluctance to be photographed, her caution around strangers, her ability to assess people's motivations. These weren't just personality quirks. They were survival skills she had maintained, because she knew that even decades later, she might still be in danger. The report also included information about Elena's handler, a man who had maintained contact with her throughout her time in America and had been responsible for ensuring her safety and security. According to the records, this handler had helped arrange her marriage to my great-grandfather Robert, who had been identified as a suitable partner because of his stable background and lack of curiosity about Elena's past. I realized with growing horror that Elena's entire American life had been constructed as an elaborate cover story. Her marriage, her integration into small-town American society, even her relationship with our family. It had all been part of maintaining her false identity and keeping her safe from people who might want to harm her. But as I sat in my apartment, surrounded by printouts of these incredible revelations, I found myself grappling with a question that the DNA results couldn't answer. How much of Elena's love for our family had been real, and how much had been part of her performance? The woman who had raised me, who had been there for every important moment of my childhood, who had made me feel loved and protected. Was she a genuinely caring person who had found peace in family life? Or was she a trained operative who had simply been very good at playing a role? I looked at the photographs I had spread across my coffee table. Elena at family gatherings, Elena teaching me to bake, Elena smiling at my high school graduation, and for the first time I wondered if any of those smiles had been genuine. The DNA results had given me the truth I'd been seeking, but they had also opened up new questions that were even more painful than the original mystery. I spent 3 days sitting on this information, trying to figure out how to tell my family that everything they believed about Alina was a lie. How do you explain to your mother that her beloved grandmother-in-law was actually a trained assassin who had been living under a false identity for 60 years? How do you tell your grandmother that her mother-in-law's entire personality might have been an elaborate performance? I finally decided to start with my mom, figuring she would be more open to hearing the evidence than my grandmother, who was now in her 80s and had idolized Alina. I called her and asked if she could come over for dinner, telling her I had found some interesting information about our family history that I wanted to share. When Mom arrived that evening, I had spread all the documentation across my dining room table like some kind of Detective S evidence board. DNA reports, historical documents, photographs, copies of intelligence records. It looked like the setup for a conspiracy theory, which I suppose it was. I started by showing her the DNA results that proved Alina wasn't who she claimed to be, then gradually worked up to the intelligence records. Mom listened quietly at first, asking clarifying questions and studying the documents I handed her. But when I got to the part about Alina being a trained operative who had killed people during the war, she stood up abruptly and backed away from the table. "This is insane, Alex," she said, shaking her head. "You're talking about Alina, sweet, gentle Alina, who used to sing me lullabies when I was sick. You're saying she was some kind of killer? This is ridiculous." I tried to walk her through the evidence step by step, but I could see that she was struggling to reconcile the Alina. She remembered what the person described in these documents. She kept coming back to memories of Alina's kindness, her devotion to the family, the way she had cared for everyone with such genuine warmth. "Even if this is true," Mom said finally, "and I'm not saying I believe it, but even if it is, what does it matter? Alina loved us. She was there for us. She made our family better. Whatever she did before she became our Alina doesn't change that." But I could see that the revelation was shaking her more than she wanted to admit. Over the next few days, Mom started calling me with questions. Had I noticed that Alina always seemed to know when people were lying? Did I remember how she used to check the locks on all the doors and windows every night before bed? Had I ever wondered why she never wanted to travel, never wanted to visit other cities or meet new people? The more we talked, the more we realized that Alina's behavior had been consistent with someone who was constantly maintaining a cover story and staying alert for potential threats. Her isolation hadn't been the natural caution of an immigrant. It had been the careful security practice of someone who knew she could be found and eliminated if she drew too much attention. The hardest part was telling my grandmother, Alina's daughter-in-law. I waited 2 weeks, hoping to find the right approach, but finally realized there wasn't going to be an easy way to have this conversation. I drove to her house on a Saturday afternoon and found her in her garden, tending to the flowers Alina had helped her plant 30 years ago. When I showed Grandma the evidence, her reaction was completely different from my mom's. Instead of denial or shock, she got very quiet and studied each document carefully. After about an hour of reviewing everything, she looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "I always knew there was something," she said quietly. "Not this exactly, but something. Alina was too perfect, too careful, too good at reading people. And she had nightmares. Terrible nightmares, where she would cry out in languages I didn't recognize. Grandma told me that she had once asked Alina about her dreams, and Alina had claimed she was reliving memories of the war and losing her family in Poland. But now, knowing what we knew, those nightmares took on a completely different meaning. She was probably reliving missions, Grandma said, wiping her eyes, reliving people she had killed or seen die. And we all thought she was just a sweet old woman mourning her lost family. But then Grandma said something that stopped me cold. You know, there was something else. After Alina died, we found some money hidden in her room. Quite a lot of money. Actually in cash and in accounts under different names. We thought maybe she had been saving secretly to surprise us, but we never could figure out where it came from. She went to a closet and pulled out a box I had never seen before. Inside were bank statements, safety deposit box keys, and documents showing that Alina had maintained multiple identities and financial accounts throughout her time in America. She had been receiving regular payments from sources we couldn't identify, and she had been maintaining what appeared to be escape funds and emergency resources. She was ready to run, I realized. Even after decades of living as Alina, she was still ready to disappear if she needed to. The most disturbing discovery was a letter Alina had written, but never sent, addressed simply to my family. In it, she apologized for the lies she had told and the life she had lived, but explained that everything she had done after coming to America, including loving us, had been genuine. "I became Alina to survive," the letter read, "but somewhere along the way, Alina became who I really was. You gave me a life I never thought I could have, and I protected that life the only way I knew how, by never letting anyone know who I had been before." The letter went on to explain that she had chosen to stay Alina, to maintain her cover story, not just for her own protection, but to protect us. She had been afraid that if the truth came out, it might put our family in danger from people still seeking revenge against former intelligence operatives. Reading that letter, I realized that Alina's greatest act of love for our family might have been maintaining her lie for 60 years, carrying the weight of her real identity, alone so that we could live normal, safe lives. In the months following these revelations, I found myself going through a kind of grief process, mourning the Alina I thought I knew while trying to accept the extraordinary woman she actually was. The hardest part wasn't learning that she had been a spy. I kept returning to memories of my childhood with Alina, analyzing them through this new lens. When she taught me to observe people carefully and trust my instincts about their character. Had she been passing on survival skills from her intelligence training? When she showed me how to be resourceful and creative in solving problems? Was she preparing me for a world where adaptability could mean the difference between life and death? The more I reflected on it, the more I realized that Alina had given me gifts I was only beginning to understand. Her emphasis on language learning, her insistence that I develop multiple skills and interests, her teaching about the importance of keeping some parts of yourself private. These hadn't been random lessons from a grandmother. They had been training from someone who understood that the world could be dangerous and unpredictable. I started researching other families of relocated intelligence operatives, and what I found was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Many of these people had struggled with depression, alcoholism, and an inability to form genuine connections because they could never fully trust anyone with their real selves. The fact that Alina had managed to create authentic relationships and find real happiness while maintaining such an elaborate deception was actually remarkable. Through online forums and genealogy groups, I connected with descendants of other relocated operatives. Their stories were similar to mine, grandparents or great-grandparents who had seemed too perfect, too careful, too skilled at reading people and situations. One woman told me about her grandfather who claimed to be a simple farmer but could fix any mechanical device, speak multiple languages, and seemed to know exactly how much cash to have on hand for any emergency. Another person shared documents showing that his grandmother had maintained correspondence with people around the world using coded language disguised as recipes and knitting patterns. When he finally cracked the code after her death, he discovered she had been part of a network of former operatives who had continued to share information and support each other decades after the war ended. These conversations helped me understand that Alina hadn't been unique in living a double life. She had been part of a generation of people who would sacrifice their true identities for the greater good and then spent the rest of their lives trying to build authentic relationships on foundations of necessary lies. I also began to appreciate the incredible mental strength it must have taken to maintain her cover for so long. Every conversation, every relationship, every moment of her American life had required her to remember her false history and suppress her real memories. The cognitive load of living such an elaborate deception while genuinely caring for a family must have been exhausting. But perhaps the most profound realization was that Alina's love for our family had been real, even if her identity wasn't. The intelligence records showed that she had been given multiple opportunities to relocate again, to assume new identities in different cities, but she had chosen to stay with us. She had chosen to maintain the Alina identity not because it was required for her safety, but because she had found genuine happiness in being our grandmother. 6 months after discovering the truth, I decided to visit the cemetery where Alina was buried. I brought flowers and the letter she had written, but never sent. I sat by her grave trying to figure out how to say goodbye to both versions of her, the Alina I had thought I knew and the Katerina I was still learning about. As I sat there, I realized that the question of whether Alina's love had been real was the wrong question. Love isn't about the accuracy of the story you tell about yourself. It's about how you treat the people in your life, how you show up for them, how you make them feel safe and valued. By that measure, Elena's love had been as real and genuine as any love I'd ever experienced. I also understood why she had never told us the truth. It wasn't just about protecting herself. It was about protecting us from the burden of carrying her secrets. She had wanted us to have normal childhoods, to grow up without the weight of knowing that our beloved grandmother was someone who had killed people and lived in constant fear of being discovered. The irony wasn't lost on me that in trying to uncover Elena's secrets, I had ended up with a deeper appreciation for the choices she had made. She had given us the gift of a loving, stable relationship, while carrying the costs of her deception alone. That was perhaps the most selfless thing anyone had ever done for our family. I started a private blog about Elena's story, partly to process my own feelings, and partly to connect with other people who had discovered similar family secrets. The responses I received showed me that there are probably thousands of families across America with similar stories, grandparents and great-grandparents, who had reinvented themselves after the war and spent decades maintaining carefully constructed identities. Today, when I look at the photographs of Elena teaching me to knit or helping me with school projects, I don't see a fraud or a performance. I see a woman who was brave enough to completely reinvent herself, skilled enough to maintain that reinvention for 60 years, and loving enough to find genuine joy in being our grandmother. Elena taught me that identity is more fluid than we like to think, that people are capable of profound transformation, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is carrying difficult truths alone, so that the people you care about can live lighter, happier lives. Now, when I think about Elena's legacy, I don't focus on the mysteries she carried or the secrets she kept. I remember the woman who taught me that survival requires adaptability, that strength can look like gentleness, and that the most important truths aren't always the ones you can find in documents or DNA tests. They're the ones you experience in daily acts of love, patience, and care that make a house feel like home and make a child feel safe enough to dream about the future.